Now sort of think with me. Let's go back to preference and evaluation for a moment before we continue with the logic of evaluation. Think of the things that you prefer. And I'm going to name things that I prefer and compare your preferences with my preferences. Furniture. I like antique over modern. Some of you probably prefer modern over antique. My grandmother said, "Why do you like that old junk?" I've been getting rid of that junk. She has a different preference. Okay, I like blue over red as a color. I have more blue things than I have red things, and in general, I like things that are tinted blue rather than things with a lot of reds in them. Okay, I'm sure lots of you have different color preferences. I prefer high-fat foods to low-fat foods. That is, give me a choice and say which would taste better. I'm going to choose the high fat every single time for taste. But now let me notice I'm not evaluating it. I'm just subjectively preferring it. When I evaluate it, I realize it's not good for my health, and so my evaluation contradicts my preference. Then I have to decide whether my preference is more important to me than what I've learned through evaluation. And this forces me maybe to a decision of ultimate values. Would I rather live a little bit longer and maybe not enjoy a lot of the meals quite as much? Or would I prefer to enjoy the meals and live a shorter lifespan? Now, ultimately, in a way, that becomes an ultimate preference, all right? And something that I have a right to judge. So if somebody wants to live a shorter life, they'd rather do that than, say, give up their smoking or whatever. That's something they can do. But we might say, are you clear about the evaluative implications in order to make sure that they really have taken into account the facts before they've exercised their final judgment of preference? Okay, so we want to keep those two separate at all times and in all places. And when those are confused, problems occur in both the teaching and, of course, the evaluation process. So now what do we know about the logic of assessment, the logic of evaluation? You always have a purpose, and problems can occur at the level of purpose. You have an unclear purpose, you're not sure exactly what you're evaluating, that's a problem. Secondly, you should know what exactly is the object of your evaluation. What isn't the object of your evaluation? What are you not going to be evaluating? Thirdly, you have to know, given your purpose, what are the appropriate criteria for assessing these kinds of things for that kind of purpose? You see, in the Olympics, there's assessment continually going on. That's the whole point, performance and assessment. And on the basis of the assessment, gold, silver, bronze, and no medal. So the assessment is going on continually, and it is not a matter of subjective preference. If it was, we could use anyone as the judge and just say, what did you like? Because, of course, some of us might like somebody who professionally isn't as good as somebody else. We just sort of like watching them for personal reasons of subjective preference. All right, so again, we have to discriminate that. If we're doing an evaluation, we're taking some things for granted. We're making some assumptions. Remember the logic of thinking. So a good evaluator knows what assumptions she or he is making. What am I taking for granted here? And you think as teachers, many things we take for granted. That students are capable of doing the activities that we're designing for them. That they're capable of learning at a certain level at a certain time. We make assumptions about them. We have to. We make assumptions about ourselves. We make assumptions about our motivation, assumptions about their motivations, many assumptions. Well, as a good evaluator, because to be a good evaluator, you have to be a good critical thinker doing an evaluation, you sort of notice your assumptions. You also have to ask, if we do evaluation in this way, what are the implications? We put this into action, what are going to be the consequences? Because evaluation might be good for one purpose, but very bad for another purpose. And you could do evaluation that actually was unlikely to produce better learning, but it gave you certain information about the students. Or you could do evaluation in such a way that its fundamental function was to increase the quality of learning of the students. For example, when teachers do all the evaluation, students don't learn, by implication, to evaluate themselves. And when they don't learn to evaluate themselves, they don't learn to think critically. So if teachers do all the evaluation, you are not going to teach your students to think critically. I don't care what value you get out of it. That's that's the downside. So part of what we have to ask as thinkers, what are the consequences of thinking in this way and behaving in this way? Then when you're evaluating from a point of view. So we have to ask, what's the point of view from which we're conducting the evaluation? And then we have to be careful. Is there another point of view we ought to have thought about in doing this evaluation process? Now, what do you evaluate in your life? I mentioned the things about which we have preferences. And there are, we have preferences about books and television programs and furniture and places to live and ways to spend our time and games and on and on. We have all these preferences. But we also evaluate. What do you evaluate? You evaluate yourself. You evaluate your life. You evaluate your relationships. You evaluate your activities. You evaluate your shopping. You evaluate yourself as a member, a citizen. You evaluate morally. You evaluate financially. You evaluate historically. You evaluate. It's all there, interwoven intricately in the texture of life. But if you're a good critical thinker, you know at any moment, am I exercising subjective preference or am I evaluating? Because they're not the same thing. You can do whatever you want, but know what you're doing. So part of what we have to do is to ask ourselves, how conscious are we of our evaluations and when we're moving over to subjective preference? For example, take poetry as a kind of professional field. Now, it's one thing to evaluate poetry using universal standards that, let's say, everyone interested in poetry for good reason agrees upon, and it's another thing to prefer a particular era of poetry, irrespective of whether, you may prefer poetry that is not as good as other poetry, but for reasons of personal joy, you just get more joy out of it. You might like Wadsworth or Edgar Allan Poe, Eula Loom, and that might be the poetry you like to read because you like very melodious. That's your preference. And in your free time, why not? It's your free time. But it's another thing to say, this is great poetry, or this poetry is better than that. So now what we have to be careful when we're teaching, say, poetry, is when are we allowing for preference and when are we asking for evaluation? It's not very good music. But so what? They're not listening to it because it is. They're listening to it because they like it. That's all. And it's a matter of pleasure. Now, let me show you how this can have very significant repercussions. Let's suppose you have students read a story, and you say, I want you to write your reaction to the story, a reaction paper. That's a disaster, because you've asked for something subjective. You cannot grade that. You're going to have to give all the students A's. Because, let's imagine, we're reading Hamlet, and I write a reaction paper. I hate this stupid stuff. This is the dumbest story I've ever read. Why do we have to read this stupid stuff? That's my reaction. I write it out, I turn it in. You asked for my reaction. I gave you my honest reaction. You've got to give me an A. It was a perfectly accurate description of my reaction. You didn't ask me to assess it, mind you. You didn't ask me to evaluate it. You didn't ask me to distinguish its strengths and merits from some point of view. You said, give me your reaction. So part of what we have to do is make sure we mean what we say. I mean, this is, I think, a good rule for both moral integrity and critical thinking. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Don't say one thing and mean another thing. I mean, we want to teach our students to be precise in the language they use. We have to be precise in the language we use. Okay, so now let's come back to the logic of evaluation. What am I saying so far? We're continually evaluating. We're continually assessing. And let me put it this way. All evaluations, all assessments are more or less ultimate in nature. There are ultimate assessments, and then there are assessments that we do because we are committed to an even broader assessment. For example, I ask my students to identify the main purpose of any assignment they're doing. I build that into the structure of the assignment. So if you're going to do an assignment, the first thing I want you to know is, why are you doing it? What's the purpose? Not your personal purpose, but what's the goal or purpose behind this assignment? Why are we doing it? And I say, if you're having trouble with a particular assignment, ask yourself, what does this have to do with the purpose of the course? And if you're not clear about what the purpose of the course is, ask yourself, why do we have schools? What's the purpose of education? And if you're not clear about the purpose of education, why are you alive? What's your goal in life? And if you don't know what your goal in life is, there's nothing further. So our goals in life determine our functions within parts of our life. Our functions within parts of our life determine our activities from day to day. And so what we should be able to do is sort of see how our values that are intrinsic to evaluation sort of play themselves out.